welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us in today's webinar, which is for semi-annual performance reporting, reporting victim services. My name is Alexa Plotkin, and I am here with my colleagues from VAWA MEI, Hannah Brittlinger and Andrew Mondock, and we are going to be presenting a slide deck today to you, which we will be emailing to you all hopefully tomorrow. So I just wanted to let everyone know you will have access to these materials. We will also be recording today's session, so that will be posted on our website, hopefully sometime next week once we receive the recording back from TA to TA. So you'll be able to watch today's session as well. And I would like to say thank you to TA for hosting us today, and to our ASL interpreters that we have on the call today to make this possible for everyone. And with that, we can get started. And Heather mentioned we do have a Q&A pod for direct questions that will go right to the presenters. So you can ask us direct questions, and you may also use the chat for if you're having technical difficulties and to see the resources that we will post throughout the presentation. Or if you had a question that you'd like to send to the group, you can post that in the group chat feature that we have in the Zoom room. And so, who is VAWA MEI? If you haven't heard of us before, it's the Violence Against Women Act Measuring Effectiveness Initiative. We ourselves are a technical assistance OVW grantee. We have received that award for many years and have been providing technical assistance to grantees and supporting OVW with performance reporting. And we do that a number of ways, one of which is giving trainings like these, and we support grantees in learning how to report accurately on performance reports. We also provide one-on-one technical assistance, and Andrew has actually just put our contact information in the chat, so you can contact us directly anytime throughout the year to ask us questions about performance reporting. And we also give grantees the tools and knowledge and ability to demonstrate the impact and effectiveness and value of VAWA-funded programs by providing resources that we host on our website. And well, Andrew, I'll have you post the link to our website if you all haven't visited our website ever. It's vawamei.org is where we host and keep all of these resources. And it is also where you can gain access to your impact link for your performance report. So I'll just make a plug if you have yet to find your performance report. It is always available on our website. So going to our website is a great place to look for resources and also to find your performance report. And so what are we going to do today in our training? We are here to talk about victim services. And so we are going to be talking about the entire victim services section. And we're not going to go through every question because today's webinar is for all discretionary grantees. And across all of the programs, the victim services sections look a little bit different. And so I just wanted to mention that if you hear something today and you're thinking, I don't think that's on my form, or I don't think that applies to my program, you're probably right, because we have all the grantees in this webinar today. So we're just generally speaking about the victim services section. And not all of the questions are the same across all programs. They're very similar, but again, they're not the same. And so we're going to be going over the questions that are generally in the victim services sections. Then we are going to test your new or renewed knowledge. So we'll give you some questions and then ask you all to provide some answers in the chat. We will view the available resources or review the available resources that you have to support you in filling out the victim services section of your form, and then the greater performance report. So we have resources on our website that can support you in filling out your entire performance report. And then we will also go over where you can go for support with your performance report. So not only for the content of the report, but if you have larger questions about just grants or about what you can and can't do with your funds, So we will direct you who you should speak to for those issues. And so we'd also just quickly like to go over some tips for successful reporting. And this is across the entire form, not just for victim services. You're going to want to only report on OVW grant funded activities and staff. So this is across the entire form. If something is not funded with the specific funds for the specific form that you are filling out, then you're not going to be reporting it on that form. So before you report staff time or activities, you're going to just first say, is this directly funded with my OVW award for the performance report that I'm filling out? And then additionally, we like to encourage use of the narrative boxes that are on the form, some of which are required or mandatory in certain sections, and most of which are optional. And the narrative boxes are there to provide some more context for the numbers that are on the form. So you can use that to provide a little more information. You can use it to provide information on some successes or challenges that you're experiencing. There's really no guidance that we can give you that would limit you for what you can write in those boxes. It's really just what you want to say about the data that you've reported on your form. And lastly, if you do not have data for some of the questions on the form, that is okay. OVW directs grantees not to guess or estimate on the form. And if you have a specific question about how you should fill in a question that's mandatory when you don't have the data for the form, then we ask that you reach out directly to VAWA MEI so we could help you fill out your form, because you do still need to answer all of the mandatory questions on the form, even if you don't have the data. So we can help you do that. And then again, I'll make a plug for our website. Visit vawamei.org to access all those reporting resources that I've mentioned. We always have past webinar recordings up on our website. So we give these topic specific webinars every season, and we always have last season's webinar recording up on the website. So you can view that before we give the next season's live recording. We have how-to guides. We also have sample forms and program specific instructions, and we have our contact information for technical assistance and much more. Now I'll pass it to my colleague, Hannah, who can go over the victim services section. We can get into it.
Thank you, Alexa. Hello, everyone. Before we get into the questions themselves, a little bit of context. Most of the data requested in this section is congressionally mandated. So Congress wants to know how many victims seeking services were served, how many could not be served, and where additional resources are needed to fully serve victims. So Alexa said, the information you provide in this section, as well as the entire form, really needs to reflect only those victims, survivors who were served or partially served or not served, and the services that were provided with your OVW program funding. A note that confidentiality is critical and of the utmost importance, as you all know. So please never include any personally identifying information in the performance reports. When to report in the victim services section, you would complete the victim services section if your OVW program grant funds were used to support victim services, legal services, or housing units during the current reporting period. And so victim services would be providing direct support, such as counseling, crisis intervention, advocacy, etc. The legal services would be grant funded support by an attorney or paralegal that is providing legal assistance. And then housing units. This applies to the transitional housing program grantees specifically. So if you fund housing units with your transitional housing grant, that would also be why you should report in the victim services section. Not all forms have the legal services section, and obviously not all forms has the housing unit section. So Alexa noted, there might be some questions we talk about that won't directly apply, but ask questions if you have questions. Another note that we will reference only domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault, and stalking during our presentation, but we recognize that programs address other crimes like abuse in later life, child sexual abuse, sex trafficking or exploitation. Some programs only focus on sexual assault services. And so just know when we reference domestic violence, dating violence, and sexual assault and stalking, it's just in general terms. Likewise, we are framing this presentation to focus on adult victims and survivors, even though there are programs that serve children and youth, either directly or indirectly exposed to violence. And so if you have questions around how to report the child victims or people indirectly exposed, ask us questions. We're here to help. Pass it back to Alexa.
Thanks, Hannah. So one of the major things you have to think about when you're going to report in the victim services section is, okay, what is a criteria for reporting a victim survivor in the victim services section of your performance report? And we like to say that there's three things you need to think about. So a victim survivor must have requested or accepted a service, and that service must be OVW program grant funded. And then they must be a primary victim of, and this is where we're using the DV, the dating violence, sexual assault, and stalking as a stand-in for all the crimes. So they must be a primary victim, and also maybe just say of the crime that your award serves. And so to report the victim survivor on the form, they have to meet all three of the above conditions. And so if you can say yes to all three of these things, then you can move to, okay, let's report them on the form. And so then you have to think about, okay, if I know when to report a victim on the form, I have to understand when do I not report them on the form. And so it's like the opposite of when I do report on the form. So a victim survivor would not be reported in the victim services section if they, number one, are seeking a service that is not funded with your OVW program grant. So if they are asking you or requesting a service and your agency is not grant funded to provide it, then you would not consider them on your form because they're requesting something that you don't provide. So that would be a strike against one of those three criteria needed to be able to report them on the form. And I would say, even if your agency does provide the service they're requesting, say you provide transportation, but maybe your rural award doesn't support the transportation, if you are looking to report them on your rural performance report, because the rural award doesn't fund that specific service, they are not requesting a service for that report. So that takes them out of the running to be reported on that report. So you have to make the connection between the service and if it's funded with that specific award in order to report them on that form. So if they are seeking a service that's not funded, they don't go on the form. If they did not accept any of the OVW program grant funded services that they were either offered or recommended, they would also be not reported on the form. And then the third criteria is that they would have to be a primary victim. So again, if they are not a primary victim of the domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault, or stalking, they would also not be reported on the form. So once you have figured out when do I report someone and that criteria, you now have to figure out, okay, I know I need to report this person. Now I have to determine their service status. And service status can either be served, partially served, or not served. And so I'll read these categories out loud to everyone. Served means that a victim received all the OVW grant funded services they requested during the reporting period. Partially served means that a victim received some, but not all, the OVW grant funded services they requested during the reporting period. And not served means that they received none of the OVW grant funded services they requested during the reporting period. And so a victim service status can change during the course of a reporting period. And I just want to point that out, that a victim can, at the beginning maybe of a reporting period, request a service that you are grant funded to provide. You are able to provide it to them, and they are the primary victim of a crime that your award serves. And then later on in the reporting period, they request another service that, for whatever reason, maybe limited capacity, you are unable to provide to them. And so by the end of the reporting period, they have received one service and not another, and their status would have gone from fully served at the beginning of the period to then partially served by the end. So you want to make sure you're keeping track of the services that you are providing to each victim over the course of the period, because the status of all of the services that a victim survivor is requesting add up to figure out what is the service status at the end of the period. And then once you have figured out the service status, you have to understand, okay, how do we now report on the number of victims served in the served, partially served, and not served categories for each crime? That is the actual question that is on the victim services section, which is essentially the second question in the victim services section. The first question is, did you use funds to provide victim services, legal services, or housing services, I think, during the course of the reporting period? And if you select yes to that question, then you are going to be answering the question of how many victims did you serve, partially serve, or not serve during the reporting period. And so using all the criteria and the information that we talked about service status, you now have to figure out, okay, what is the number of victims in each service status and category that I am going to report on that. And you need to report victim survivors as what we call an unduplicated count. And so we give that definition as victim survivors reported as either served, not served, or partially served should be counted only once in each reporting period they received grant funded services. And so as an example, I can say, if I were to serve Hannah one time in the reporting period with transportation, and then she came back to my agency and I served her again with counseling services. And then perhaps she came back again and we did employment services. I have provided her services on 3 separate occasions, but she is but one victim, one person that I served during the reporting period. So when I am counting her as the number of victims I served in the reporting period, I am going to count her only one time during the 6-month reporting period because I don't want to duplicate her as a person. I don't want to duplicate her victim count. We are able to report all of the services and the times we provided those services to her in a separate part of the victim services section, but the number of times that we want to report a victim is as an unduplicated count. And then we also want to report victims under their primary victimization, even if victims have experienced more than one type of victimization.
Okay. Oops. Mouse got out of control. When reporting victims as partially served or not served, you would then also need to provide details about why you were unable or your program was unable to provide those grant-funded services. And so on the vast majority of performance reports, there is a checkbox list that lists out reasons for partial or non-service. Your program reached capacity, the program rules were not acceptable, you had limited resources. You would check all of the reasons that apply for the victims that you or survivors you reported as partially or not served. So this question does not capture totals. It's simply check the reasons that apply. If you find yourself wanting to use the other box, pause and think. What determines a victim's service status is your organization's ability to provide the requested grant-funded service, not the victim or survivor's decision around continuing with the services. So if you find yourself wanting to report the survivor did not return, if in the eyes of the form, if the survivor did not return, that is the survivor no longer requesting grant-funded services. So you would not take into consideration the services they did not return for. If a victim or survivor refused the services, the grant-funded services that you offered, that is also not a reason for non-service. If you recall, Alexa noted the victim or survivor needs to request or accept grant-funded service in order to be reported in the victim services section. If the services are not provided by your grant program, you would also not report or take into consideration those services when deciding if the victim was fully served, partially served, or not served. Because remember, the services that you are reporting on this form are those grant-funded services. So everything needs to be tied back to what your grant funds supported. If you could not locate the victim survivor when you went to offer the services, that's essentially the victim survivor not accepting the grant-funded service that you are offering. So you would not record those individuals as partially or not served. I do have some examples to go through that I hope will help. I see questions going through the chat. I'm going to go into the first example, and then maybe we can pause and we can note any questions out loud. But so let's say your OV grant program funds crisis intervention, counseling, and civil legal advocacy. A victim or survivor of domestic violence requests crisis intervention and transportation. you provide crisis intervention, but do not provide transportation. How would you report them? So you can use the chat if you'd like to indicate how you would capture this individual on the form. Would this victim be counted as served? Or B, partially served, C, not served, or D, not reported? Great. See the answers coming in. My apologies, Andrew, for if there are any unanswered questions in the chat. We will make sure those all get answered. But yeah, for everyone that said A, served, that is right. So in this example, you would report the victim as fully served because you were able to provide the grant-funded service that they requested. And so you would not consider them partially served, as you're reporting only on your organization's ability to provide the services that you are grant funded to provide. I can pause before we do the next example. Alexa, I'm wondering if there's any questions we should note out loud.
Yes, I think there was a question that was centering on partially served and referrals, and I want to clarify that if a victim survivor requests a service from your agency and it is a service that you are funded to give, and they are a primary victim, and so they meet all the criteria, and then you refer them out to somebody else, or I'm not clear about someone if they were wondering if if you are if they are coming to you and you, let's say, requesting something that you don't provide because you're making a referral, and what you're saying is the service is the referral. OVW doesn't classify information, advice, and referrals. I could make the caveat for most programs as a victim service, unless you're a legal services provider, really, and you're providing like information, advice, and referrals, and they cross over really into what is more of a legal service as the information, advice, and referral. And so for most victim service providers, if you're getting a victim asking you for a service and you're referring out, that veers into the category of what we call not reported, and you're actually just passing them on to someone else. And then I just want to make reference to, if you are offering a service and it is being requested of you and a victim chooses not to follow up with you, and so they never come back for the service, like if transportation was requested and you said, great, I will be able to provide that on this date, and a victim never shows up for it, you would not necessarily report that as either partially served or not served, because you as the provider were fully there and able to provide the service, but the victim never took advantage of it. They never followed up with you. So that's also a situation in which you would not report the victim at all if you had not engaged with them because they didn't choose to follow up with you. So there are situations in which you actually just don't report at all, and they don't fall into that category of either served, partially served, or not served. It's actually just not reported. And so I just wanted to clarify that we have this fourth category of not reported.
I would say too that on most performance reports, there is a question related to hotline support information. And so there is a place, if you use your grant funds to support a text line, a hotline, a web-based chat line, you can count those instances of requesting information in that question. However, it's not until a victim or survivor takes a step further to receiving crisis intervention or more of a in-depth service, that's when they would be reported as a primary victim in the first question of the victim services section.
Yep. And then just to clarify, somebody did ask a great question that somebody might return to you and they might have experienced a different instance of violence. So it could be a different offender and it's a different crime, but it's the same person. And again, we just want to emphasize that in each reporting period, every victim is counted only once. So it's an unduplicated count of the victim. And in that situation, you may have to choose which victimization category you are going to place them in terms of the victim count in the victim services section in question 2, because you do only have the ability to report them once for their primary victimization for the number of victims who are fully served, partially served, and not served. And then there is an additional question on the form that asks for the victims who experienced multiple victimizations, where you're able to check off additional boxes. And this is not victim specific, but there are just additional boxes that can reflect the additional victimizations that folks have experienced. So it's not a perfect one-to-one capturing of the experience, but it is a way to capture that. And there is a little bit of choice for you as the provider and who's collecting this information, how you are reporting that. Okay, so yes, we are on to our example here, number 2. And I just saw Rebecca said, what factors are relevant to that choice? Is one preferable? And I will just say, we do not have any sort of advice or information to give you on that about what is preferable or not preferable. So I think just be consistent and on how you report so that your reporting reflects how you do this at your agency, is the advice we would give for reporting when there is the ability to make those choices. So example number 2, your OVW grant funded program offers counseling and legal advocacy. A victim survivor of stalking requests these 2 grant funded services, and you are unable to provide either service because your program is at capacity. So how would you report them? So we have our 3 service categories and then that 4th not reported. And I think this one is one of those kinds of softball questions, and it looks like everybody's getting not served, which means we are training correctly, because yes, the victim would be reported as not served because you were unable to provide either grant funded service. And so you would report them as not served, and then you would check off program reach capacity as the reason for not served. So example number 3, your OVW program grant funds group and counseling services. A victim survivor of sexual assault comes to your office and requests transportation and legal accompaniment, which you can provide through other funding. How would you report this person? So we have the 3 categories of served, partially served, not served, and then this 4th category of just not reported. I'll let everybody think about that for a minute, for less than a minute here. And it looks like D is an overwhelming choice here. And again, it makes me feel good about the way we are training, because the answer is, in fact, D, not reported. Because this person only requested services that your agency is not actually grant funded to provide, you would not be reporting them, because we have to think about the criteria that it takes to get somebody onto the form. And to get someone on the form, they have to meet the criteria of, number 1, requesting a grant funded service. And so if we think about that criteria, they didn't meet that. So that immediately takes them out of the running to even get them on the form. And someone says, what if the service is with a subcontractor that is listed under the grant? And so that would be fine because the grant is funding that. So we always say with performance reporting, follow the funds. If you have a staff person and they're working outside of your agency, that's fine. They get reported on the form in the staff section like they work at your agency, because the form is looking to report staff and activities that are supported with the funds. So in the eyes of the form, everything is just at the agency. It doesn't really matter inside, outside, wherever, as long as it's funded with the award, it's going on the form. So you can just think about if there's a direct connection from the funding to the activity or the staff, then it goes on the form. Okay. And so let's just say, although your agency provided and requested the services, they were not OVW grant funded services, so you shouldn't report them. So again, you have to make the distinction between what your agency does and what the funded activities of your agency is doing.
So on a good handful of performance reports, there is a question where grantees can report on secondary victims that are served with grant funds. And so secondary victims are those who are indirectly affected by the victimization. So the sexual assault, domestic violence, dating violence, or stalking. And that can include children, siblings, spouses, or intimate partners, parents, grandparents, or other affected relatives. The secondary victim must receive grant-funded services to be reported. And the forms only request the number of secondary victims served. They do not ask for their demographics or the services they were provided. So do not include secondary victims in the following questions when you fill out the form. Do not include them in the demographics or in the services that were provided questions. However, if you do want to provide information about what services you were able to provide with your grant funds to these secondary victims, you can use the narrative questions to provide that context and that detail. There's a narrative question at the end of the victim services section, as well as those narratives at the very end of the form. Demographics. So each victim that's reported as served and partially served typically needs to have a demographic reported on them. So victims, there are 3 different demographics that are captured: race and ethnicity, sex, and age. And so victims can be reported in more than one race and ethnicity category. However, the total race and ethnicity will need to be equal to or greater than the victims that are reported as served and partially served. And so on my screen, for example, is the Rural Performance Report. Question 9 of the Victim Services section lists out the race and ethnicities. You can report a victim in each category that applies to them and how they identify. We just need this total down here to at least equal the total number of victims that are reported as served and partially served in question number 2. If you do not provide enough victims in this question, you will receive a validation error. So here in question 1, I have reported only one victim as served. If I do not report any and this total stays 0 and I click go to the next page, I get a red text message that says that the total must be greater than or equal to the total number of victims reported as served and partially served in the victim services section. At which point, if, say, I do not know how that survivor identifies, I can report it in unknown. The validation error went away, and then I can proceed. There's a question about reporting sex. You would simply report the sex for the victims or survivors in the category that applies to them, and do not include victims for whom sex is not known. So this total does not need to equal that total served, partially served. So I can move on. And then total age, this needs to equal the number of victims reported as served and partially served. So I will not be able to move on unless I account for that one victim I reported. Quick note, victims should never be required to share demographic information as a condition of service. So while the form is requesting this information, this should not be a barrier to providing services. And if you do not know it, that is okay. Use the unknown fields as appropriate.
So now that we have talked about how to report victims, we now have to get into how we report the services that you all are providing. And so when we get to the actual victim services question of the victim services section, we are going to be reporting the number of victims who received each service and the number of times. So you're going to report only the OVW grant funded services provided to victim survivors reported as served or partially served at the beginning of the victim services section. So if you reported 404 total victims served and partially served at the beginning of the victim services section, that is the number of victims you have to work with in this question. So for each category, you can report no more than that per category. So you're going to report the number of victims and then the number of times that service was provided in the table. And just a note, Hannah mentioned some validation errors that happen in the impact tool, and this is one we would like to point out. The total number of victims served in any individual service category, so in each row of the victim services table for the type of service, the individual service category cannot be greater than the total number of served and partially served victims reported in victim services section question number 2. So like I mentioned, if you reported 404 total victims served and partially served in any individual service category, you cannot report a number greater than 404. And so when I reported 405 victims in civil legal advocacy court accompaniment, it gave me a validation error. So you just want to make sure you're connecting the number of victims reported as served and partially served in the beginning of the victim services section to how many victims you're reporting in your victim services section in these service category tables.
I also want to note before we move on to legal assistance that, and I think Alexa said this, you can report a victim as receiving all of the grant funded services that they received. So this total here cannot be greater than that 404. However, Civil legal advocacy can be 404 victims receiving it. Victim advocacy can also be 404 victims receiving a service.
So when we were talking about how you cannot duplicate the number of victims reported as served and partially served, the victim services service table is not an unduplicated count in this table. But you cannot in an individual service category report a number greater than the total, but throughout the section you can report a victim in every service category that you served them. So you can have a really big total. And yes, we will be sending the slides after the training. I hope to be able to send them tomorrow morning when I receive the attendee list from TA to TA. So these PDFs will be sent directly to you. And also a plug on Wednesdays, which is tomorrow at 1 p.m. You can register for our office hours. And if you have additional questions after viewing this webinar today, you can follow up with us and you can register for that on our website.
Okay. For the sake of time, we will continue forward. Some programs, a lot of programs are allowed and able to use their grant funds to support and funding attorneys or paralegals, or it could be an advocate, a lay advocate in a tribal court. There are other situations where you should be reporting in the legal services section. But the important thing is that the individual that is grant funded is providing legal assistance, grant funded legal assistance. This section has a few questions. You report the total number of victims. I can pull it up. You report the total number of victims that received assistance with legal issues. You report the total number of victims who received assistance with multiple legal issues. And then you report information on the types of legal issues that they received support for. You report the number of victims that received support for that. And then when their issue or case is resolved or closed, you would report the number of cases that are resolved or closed. A note that you should report non-legal services provided by grant-funded attorneys and paralegals in that victim services table we had pulled up. Language services, transportation, if those are provided by attorneys, you can still report that in the victim services table. You would capture legal advocacy, paperwork support, court accompaniment that's provided by grant-funded advocates or other non-attorney staff in that victim services table. But the legal services section is really set up to capture grant-funded support provided by attorneys or paralegals or the likes of that. There is also a section for transitional housing program grantees, specifically capturing information on housing units. So if you are a transitional housing grantee and you use your grant funds to fund housing units, there is a section for you to fill out. You would indicate that you do use funds for that, and then report on the type of unit, as well as the total number of victims, survivors, children, other dependents that are receiving housing services through those units, and the number of bed nights. You will also provide additional information around the length of stay, their destination upon exit. If you want additional support in learning how to report in that section, please come to our office hours or access the instructions or reach out for one-on-one TA. We're happy to support with that.
Okay, this is going to be one of our last slides that has any real content on it about the victim services section. And then we end with some slides about where do you go to for help. And so I think we'll just spend most of our final time on this slide to emphasize the information about the victim services section. And you'll get the full slide deck to get the contact information and where you go for help emailed to you all. So the victim services section has all of these different service options for you all to report on for the victims that you report as served and partially served. You can report the victim services you provide, perhaps the legal services, housing services, or shelter services as it applies to your award. But the important thing to know is that you need to report at least one service for every victim survivor reported as served or partially served. So I'll go back to the 404 victims. If I reported 404 victims as served or partially served on my rural program form, then somewhere across the victim services section, I need to be reporting at least 404 victim services, whether that's through victim services, legal services, housing services, or shelter services. And so you can see the bulleted list of, for 404 victims, I might report 100 victims receiving crisis intervention, 50 victims receiving language services in the victim services table. I might report 25 victims and 10 family members receiving emergency shelter services, and 229 victims receiving legal assistance with various legal issues. And you can see underneath that, I have 100 victims plus 50 plus 25. We don't include the 10 family members because they are secondary victims, plus the 229 who received legal assistance, and that's 404 total. And that would be the minimum amount of services that I need to have in order to reflect one service for each of the 404 total victims that I reported as served and partially served. So as you report on the form and you're going through your victim services section, you're always going to want to check back to that first, or really that second question in the victim services section for that number of victims you reported as served and partially served, because it's going to be the guide for all of the other information that you fill out in the section. So the demographic information connects back to the number of victims you reported as served and partially served, and the number of services ultimately connects back to the number of victims you reported as served and partially served. And the impact tool doesn't always provide like stop validations. That doesn't let you progress through the form if you're not providing enough services, because it would just be too complicated to build all of those validations into the form to not let you move through if you don't provide one service for each victim. But it is something that happens a bunch, that a program manager or we at ValMEI, when we review the data, we might notice that a grantee reported serving a high number of victims, but then the form doesn't really match with their services to the number of victims reported. So it's just, we want you to keep in mind with the victim services section that the services in the victim services section should really be reflecting and matching the number of victims that are reported. Okay. I'm just gonna go right past this one, Hannah.
Okay. Then in our final minutes, if you have questions or need technical support with your Just Grants account, contact Just Grants directly. VAWA MEI unfortunately does not have access to Just Grants, and so recommend you make sure you can get into your account sooner rather than later, that you have the permissions you need to submit your report by the due date. Andrew also in the chat provided the phone and email. This is specifically for OVW grantees. If you need to verify grant-funded activities, if you need approval for products or deliverables, if you need, or if you're not going to submit your performance report on time, contact your OVW grant manager. They're the ones that will be able to help you. And if you reach out to us, we will direct you back to your grant manager. Lastly, reach out to us if you need technical or logistical support with the Impact tool. If you have questions on the content of your reporting form, or if you want one-on-one technical assistance, reach out via phone, email, our website. Please, that's what we are here for. I would like to again thank TA2TA for hosting. Thank you all for attending, and thank our ASL interpreters for supporting our webinar today. Reach out if you need any support. That is what we are here for.